Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Assistant Chief Deputy District Attorney Thien Ho. The East Area Rapist, or the Golden State Killer, committed his crimes and wreaked havoc across the state of California from 1974 to 1986, where he committed 13 known murders, upwards of 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries up and down the state of California in 11 different counties. So many lives were changed because of his evil. People living in Sacramento County in the mid-'70s would leave their doors unlocked, their windows open to enjoy the Delta breeze. Kids would be playing late into the night, and couples would walk out on the street late at night. But that all changed when he committed his crime spree in Sacramento County. My guests today face that very evil directly. They are survivors who have turned into wonderful advocates. I want to extend a warm welcome to Kris Pedretti and Hardwick. Kris, let me start with you first. Can you please introduce yourself to our audience and briefly tell us about your current advocacy presenting sexual assault survivors? It's time to tell your story.
Absolutely. So, like you said, my name is Kris Pedretti, and I started a group, Sexual Survivors. It's time to tell your story, because I just felt like victims needed a place where they could get support, where they could get education, where people that maybe weren't a victim, maybe they could get education on how better to support victims. In the site, we have like small little podcasts, kind of like what we're doing today, but in the safety of our group, so that if victims want to speak up, that they can and feel safe about doing that. They can share their stories. I mean, we all know that healing starts with telling your story. Healing starts with being able to share and to not feel judged, and to, feel accepted, and to be able to ask for the support that they need so much.
Can you kind of expand a little bit on why it was that you started this advocacy work in terms of, your road, towards advocacy?
Yeah. So when I was raped at 15, I was ordered to silence from my father. And, he was doing the best he could. He thought that was going to probably be more protective, because back in 1976, it was a different year than it is now. And once D'Angelo was captured, I felt so much support. I felt so much love through Sacramento County, through my community, through my friends and my family. And I had never even told anybody, and I felt the shame for so many years. And it truly affected my life negatively. I lived 42 years with PTSD, not knowing what that was. And, I switched jobs a lot. I had failed marriages, lots of failed relationships. I didn't trust anyone. It was a very lonely existence. And I realized by the complete flip of my life that this didn't have to happen had there been support. And I do believe that there are so many men and women out there holding it in, living in isolation. And I could not turn my back on that. I needed to pay it forward, because I was rescued. I was saved. I got my life back. And if there is anything I can do to pay that forward, I feel like that's my responsibility going forward. And so I created the group, hoping to reach these people that are feeling alone. And I was going to be happy with one person. If there was one person that I could have helped, I would have felt that I had done what I set out to do. And now we have a little over 700 members and still growing. And it just shows that there are people out there that need support. And I'm happy to provide that if I can.
Kris, thank you for all the fantastic work that you do there. If you're willing to do so, would you be willing to at least describe a little bit of what happened in your particular case in regards to the East Area Rapist?
Yeah. So I was 15. We established that. And I lived in that community that you described, right? Doors unlocked, windows open. My parents had gone to a Christmas party and we didn't think anything of it. They'd be back. My sister was at work. She'd be back at 9, no big deal. And so I started to play the piano, and within seconds there was a knife at my throat and somebody kind of, growling in my ear that if I didn't do what he wanted, that I would be killed. And that began the night of horror for me. Over the next hour and a half, really that seemed like all night long to me. I was threatened to be killed. I was raped 3 different times. I was tied and left out. It was December 18th, week before Christmas. So it was very cold outside. And just the emotional terror that this monster had no problem inflicting on me, had me believing that I was going to die that night. And it was truly life-changing. And all of the world that I knew of safe and happy and Christmas shopping and all of that, dissolved within an instant.
How would you describe sort of your interaction and experience with law enforcement? And this was back in 1976 with law enforcement when they came to the house and started the investigation of the case.
Well, keep in mind, again, 1976, the perspective, I guess, of rape was that it wasn't that serious, in my opinion. I mean, there was only a 3-year statute of limitation. So I'm going to say hopefully it's different now. But then it was insanely crazy. And there were police everywhere. And although I was the victim, I felt like I wasn't even there, to be honest with you. No one wanted to know how I was doing, or could I use a blanket, or, what is there someone that we can call for you? Is there someone that you want next to you? None of that happened. It was an interview. It was a straight interview from a fact-finding man. And he needed to interview and get the facts. We understand that, but I needed empathy and I needed to feel safe. And I think that if those two had worked together better, they could have got even more information than what they got. So that was it. And then they left, and, it was over and done. And I never heard from them again. Now, I'm not saying they didn't have contact, because I was 15, so they may have called my parents, but there was no empathy. It was, I've got a job to do. Here I am to do it. They were asking me questions. They called it an interview, but for a 15-year-old being asked the questions I was asked, that was not an interview. It was humiliating. And it was unintentionally putting blame, I think, on me. And I was just so trying to hold it together that I was frozen. I couldn't even respond. And so I would say it was a fact-finding mission. And again, I just have to throw it in. Had they taken a little more time with me, maybe I could have given them better information.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Gay, can you please introduce yourself to our audience and briefly tell us about your current advocacy work?
Sure. My name's Gay Hardwick, and I was the 31st victim of the Golden State Killer. And I lived in isolation with my my burden of shame and guilt and lack of closure for decades. And after I was able to meet other survivors in 2019, and it took that long because remember, the arrest came in 2018. But when I finally was able to meet with a group of survivors, it was like a breath of fresh air. For the very first time, I was able to set my burden down among people who had no doubts in their mind, accepted me fully, understood exactly what I had experienced. And it was a huge relief that I didn't know I needed, but I definitely did. And over the course of the last few years, I came to realize how many people are never, ever able to put their burden down. They have no place to share their experience with people who understand and can support them. And there's also still the culture of rape that we live in, where it is, there's so much stigma attached and lack of trust, I feel, toward the victim who does come forward, that it perpetuates this burden of shame and guilt that the victim ends up carrying with them, especially if their case is unresolved. They end up going through life, and people who know them, their perception, the victim's perception is it had somehow been okay for this to happen to them, and they're now expected to just go forward and act like nothing ever happened, perform as usual, resume their life. And it's very difficult to do because now you're living with a lot of scars from the attack, the PTSD. You're still trying to do your daily functions and your jobs, but it's like trying to do it with one hand tied behind your back. You know, you're now in a different state, and your central nervous system has been altered. And many victims don't know that. It took me 7 years to be diagnosed, and almost a nervous breakdown before I was. So my work is as a moderator on the Facebook site, where we are able to support victims who have questions or want to share their story. And we can encourage them to seek help where there is that they may not know about, to seek education through books, through trauma therapy, which didn't exist back when Kris and I were having our terrible experiences, and that there's hope out there for them to actually find their healing path. That, we know the benefit of speaking with other survivors, and we encourage them to speak with us, and not to give up on their hopes and dreams of a full, productive, and happy life.
Great. Thank you for the work that you do. Gay, if you're willing to do so, can you describe your encounter with the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist?
Yeah. I was 24, and my husband and I had just purchased a home in Stockton, California, a few months earlier. He had just left the public defender's office, where he had started his law career, and he'd gone to work for a private firm. And I was working as a marketing director for a real estate development company in Stockton. So we both had very full careers, and our normal routine was, 5 days full of hard work, and Friday evening, that was our time to go out and enjoy each other's company again and do something special. So we had gone out to dinner that night and gone to a movie, and got home around 11 o'clock and watched the news on TV, I think, for a few minutes, and went to bed. Mm-hmm. Sometime after that, after midnight, I think, we were awakened by the shaking of the bed. I think he had put his foot on the end of the bed and allowed authority-filled voice saying, "Time to wake up, folks," and wake up. And then it was shut up after that. Mm-hmm. And because we were, of course, coming out of a deep sleep, couldn't see anything but a bright light and a gun and a shape at the end of the bed and a voice telling us that if we made a move or a sound that he would kill us. So, our attack went like all of the rest, where the gun was pointed at both of us, then at my husband's head, and I was forced to tie him or he would just kill him. And as soon as I was done tying him, he retied him and tied me and separated us, went back and put dishes on my husband's back so that he would hear if there was any noise, and he would kill me. And he stayed, it went on for several hours, and it was a violent attack, multiple times, quite horrific. And in between attacks, he would rummage through the rooms and through drawers. He mumbled to himself. At times I felt it sounded like he was crying, or maybe he was on the verge of laughing. It was hard. It was like having a demon in your house, and a full sense that this was something very evil, and it made my skin crawl. There was no doubt in my mind that I was going to die that night. And at that time, at those moments, I wasn't so sure that my husband hadn't already been killed. So, he rummaged around. He sat on the patio and drank beer. Finally, he would, pretend to leave, and then he would be right there. And finally, I didn't hear him for maybe 15 minutes, and I just couldn't hold still any longer. And I was still bound, hand, foot, and blindfolded. But I started to move, and I managed to yell for my husband, and I didn't get any response because he was still believing that the trickery was going on, and that if he responded, he would be killed. And, he finally responded, and I wasn't able to stand up. I had to kind of crawl down the hall to our bedroom. And between the two of us, we got the telephone receiver off the rotary phone, and I dialed the O for the operator behind my back. And we were able to get connected finally to the dispatch. Mm-hmm. And she sent the police, and she said, "Now they're on their way. I'm going to hang up." And I said, no, you can't hang up, because I can't call you back. It took me 3 tries to finally reach the operator. Just stay, And so she said, "Oh, okay, I'll stay." And then we heard police shouting out, "Police were in the house." And it seemed like there were more than 2 who came into our room.
More than 2
officers. And, they had full gear and guns drawn, and because they didn't know what they were walking into, and it was 2:00 in the morning by then.
They were worried that he might have still been there,
Right.
Can I ask you, in regards to now that the police have arrived, Gay, can you sort of describe sort of your experience with law enforcement as to the investigation part of it after they arrived?
Yes. We were cautioned not to touch anything. And we sat in the family room. I initially, when they came in, we were unclothed, and I stood up to reach for my robe, and I was immediately stopped. And it was like, okay, what are you doing? And all of a sudden I felt very constrained, I guess. And I said, I just would like to get my robe. And so he allowed me to open the closet door and grab my robe. And I'm, obviously they didn't know what I was about to grab. So that there was that. I wasn't allowed to dress, and I had to stay in that state for many hours. And I was placed in like the family room, and then my husband and I were separated while different officers spoke to each of us separately. And then they came, like a crew showed up to collect evidence. And there was a lot of evidence that was disturbing to me that was there. And, for example, there was a personal hygiene item that had been removed from my body during the course of the attack, and it was just left there. And I was mortified by that. That all these people were walking around, and this was in the middle of the room. And I found that very embarrassing and mortifying. The people who were doing the fingerprinting, they came to do their jobs. So there was a lot of banter going on all of a sudden, a lot of activity. And it just seemed very surreal to me to sit there and have all of this going on. We just had our house painted, and now I saw the technicians painting all the woodwork with graphite material to collect the fingerprints, if there would be any. And it was just very saddening to me to see my house destroyed that way. And it had already been ransacked, of course, by the rapist. After an hour or so, someone brought in donuts and coffee and set them on the table. And I said, "Oh, that coffee smells good." And the officer said, "Oh, that's for the people from Sacramento that are coming in." And then he just went on about his business. And I was, at that point thinking I could really use a cup of coffee or something, to eat. And so I just felt like a piece of evidence being sort of moved around as needed while they photographed and took fingerprints and pictures. And finally they left in the morning about daylight. I wasn't taken to the hospital until about 5 o'clock in the morning. And that was because they didn't have any female officers. And as it turned out, my option at that hour was that I could wait until 8 o'clock for a female officer to come on duty, or just go with a male officer. And I said I would go. So we went to the hospital and came back. And I guess it was about 8 o'clock in the morning by then, and the police were wrapping up, and they left. And I went back to my bedroom, and one of the items that they needed was there had been a like boot blacking or shoe polish that was on the sheet from his boots or something. But instead of taking the whole sheet, the officers or the technicians had just cut a large hole out of the sheet and left the rest of it there for me. And it was very disheartening to walk in, and traumatizing, and see that. So I had to take care of that. And then we went outside, and the crime tape was still all over the house, and our neighbors were starting to come out to pick up their newspapers. And it was up to us, to go out there and remove all of the signs of what had happened. And so those are things that I think could be done differently today, that there could be more sensitivity toward the victim who might have to be there to witness the evidence taking, and to do it in a more sensitive manner, rather than to add, to the destruction.
I think both of you really kind of highlight the need for empathy. The need for empathy when you're dealing with victims and survivors, especially of violent crimes, especially of this nature. And so, Kris, I'll start with you, and I want to talk to Gay about it as well. What sort of training have you provided recently to law enforcement, or given to law enforcement, so that they have some perspective, from the victim's point of view, about how to show more empathy or sensitivity in the investigation of these cases? So, Kris, what have you started doing?
Well, one of the things that I do with the group, Sexual Assault Survivors, It's Time to Tell Your Story, is we also get together physically, in the warmer weather, those that live in town. And there's always a guest speaker. And so one of our guest speakers was a detective from the Elk Grove Police Department. And from her training to us, she thought, they're not going to want to hear much from us. And it was really interesting, because I think 2 hours later, we were still asking questions. But at the end, she asked me, would you ever be willing to come and talk to our officers about your perspective on what happens when a woman or a man, a victim, is going through the process of reporting their assault. And so that's how that started. So I went in, and Gay was with me. Mm-hmm. And we were really able to share our perspective of what it is that we need for them to get what they need. Right. And I think I talked about that a little earlier. And, it starts, from the very, very beginning, when they're coming in to our homes, and they need information. And we know that they may have just come from a murder call, or maybe they've got, another assault waiting. So, it's kind of an unfortunate match, I think, from the beginning, because they have one need and we have a complete other need. Our need is to feel safe. And we know through statistics that only 25% of women report. And there's a reason for that, right? It's completely scary, or they don't think they're going to be believed, or, whatever. Maybe it was a family member and they don't want to bring their family into it. They're still trying to protect. And so I think that was kind of the part of the training that was most important to me, is to be aware that there's two different needs happening. And, like Gay was talking about, even in her own experience, she failed in so many different ways, and not because the officers meant to. I think that they just weren't aware. And that's where this training needs to come in. Offer us a blanket if we need it. Ask me, is there somebody that you would like to have with you? I think that the empathy has to start from the very, very beginning. You have to notice, you got to set the interview scene. Ask them where they want to be interviewed. What if where I was interviewed was the same room that one of the rooms that I was raped in. So maybe I don't want to be in that room. Is there a place that you would rather be? Can I get you something to drink? It's okay that you're scared. You can vent. Go ahead. It's all right. I'll listen. This is before the interview even starts. And then when that victim is ready, if they've had any training, or that they can just kind of read that victim, they're going to see them take that breath. And we are reporting because we believe justice will be done. We are reporting because we want him to be captured. We're reporting because we think it's the right thing to do. So first and foremost during that interview is believe us, and sometimes officers need to ask questions that might appear to be more blaming, like, what were you wearing? Why were you out so late? Obviously that didn't happen with me, but this is what I hear a lot through our group is you may be asking the question because you need it, but there's a way to ask the question. Hey, where are the clothes that you were wearing? Are these because we may need them for evidence? Explain why you're asking these questions. Notice if you've hit a trigger and give me a moment and let me take my time and I might stray off. I think most victims, we just kind of go a different direction. Listen, don't cut me off, but gently bring me back. And I could probably go on and on and on, but it's just about basic empathy and understanding that this is your call. This is your job. And you have to stay detached. I get that. Like, I can't even imagine our officers and what they go through and the horror that they see on a daily basis. If they let that get to their heart, we wouldn't have a very good system. But understand that that is their job. We get that. But now also understand that my world just was ruined. The world that I knew and I felt safe in is now gone. And everyone's around me doing their job, but no one's remembering that my life just ended, And so I would say being able to do that training with the officers was, oh my gosh, it was just amazing. They were very open. They listened to what we had to say. We did have feedback later. Thank you. This is, we do have to remember, this is it's not just a one perspective. There's two things going on. So I feel I'm just going to throw this in that all of our police departments, no matter where they are in the city or in the county of Sacramento, should be inviting us in and other victims in so that the end goal for us is this guy gets caught. The end goal for our police officers is this guy gets caught. We have the same goal. Let's help us get there.
Those are fantastic suggestions. And that was sort of one of the, when you guys told me about what you were doing in the training, part of this podcast is to get this information out to our law enforcement. And I think it's a great idea to invite you to come into the different agencies and starting with in the county here to really give another perspective to law enforcement and for this discussion to start. Gail, let me ask you, how can the community help in regards to this effort, in regards to advocacy and this empathy? How can the community help?
Well, I think there has to be more conversations about sexual assault and rape in order to destigmatize the subject. And right now, I think there's still a lot of tendency on the part of the population in general to turn away from these crimes. And I think there's still a lot of implicit biases that people hold toward victims, whether they vocalize them or not, about whether or not you were somehow complicit in bringing this upon yourself. And we all know in these cases, particularly, that nobody brought any of this on themselves. There was a psychopath, and none of us had contributed in any way to these attacks, not any way you conceive of. But even after the arrest, people that I'd known for 20 years, but just didn't know it, they didn't know that I was a victim and that my husband was a victim, would say things that were just thoughtless because they don't know how to support a survivor. And such as, how did you come to know this person? Just assuming that you knew the person, that you associated with someone who would do such a thing. not even thinking that it could be an absolute random stranger attack. Someone said to my husband, "You're such an athletic guy. Really, there wasn't anything you could do." And, we were both there. We knew that we were lucky to have survived that night. And we knew it even more when we learned that the couple who were couple number 30, the Maggioris, were not able to survive. We didn't know that at the time, but we knew in our situation that there was nothing that we could do with a gun at our heads and coming out of a deep sleep. There was no opportunity. But it's thoughtless for someone to put that burden on you that, that wouldn't have happened to me because I'm athletic, and it just that's just not how things happen in real life. Mm-hmm. So more conversations, more destigmatization, understanding that survivors need support. They need their loved ones to be able to talk about what happened with them. They need to be aware that there are trauma therapies available, and to help survivors find these and access them. And we do hear from victims who say, "I would like to see a trauma therapist, but my insurance won't cover it, and so I can't." And these are people who could benefit from some type of assistance. Also, something that was thrown around early after the arrest, when I first talked to the local DA here, was, "Well, you have the right to attend the hearings and things, because of Marcy's Law, I guess it was." And it was like, well, everybody knows what that is. Well, we didn't know what that was. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure most victims know what that is unless they have been given those rights. And no one ever gave us those rights. In fact, Kris and I researched that on the internet ourselves because we kept hearing the term and we didn't know. And so many of us in the outlying counties didn't know what our rights were and weren't told. So things like that should become more commonplace, just like we know our rights about being arrested, the Miranda rights. We understand those, and that's commonplace, but Marcy's Law is not.
You bring up a lot of great points there. And you also mentioned, Gay, in terms of the arrest and the prosecution of Joseph DeAngelo. And I frankly think that we could probably do an entire podcast just on that case itself and what happened from the moment he was arrested to the prosecution of the case and through the ending of the case when he was sentenced and taken away to prison. Probably multiple podcasts on it. But I want to take a step back. I remember meeting both of you at different times in the courtroom when we were prosecuting Joseph DeAngelo for that. Just looking back now, and looking back from 2018 when he was arrested and essentially 2020 as we go forward with the litigation of the case and ending it. When you look back on the case now, and I'll start with you, Kris, what is the one thing that comes to your mind now that you think about the case and the case, in terms of him being in prison? What is the one thought that comes to your mind?
The incredible support that we received from the County of Sacramento, the victim advocates, our DA, prosecutors, hands down, from the communication sharing. Not all counties had that. In fact, we as victims, we looked out for each other, and we actually created our own Facebook group just for us because Gay didn't get the information I got, or Ventura County got information that another person didn't get. And I feel as though in Sacramento, we pretty much got all of the information, but this was just such a vastly diverse groupings of counties that not every county handled it the same way. So I feel for me, we were handled with such respect. In fact, I remember us calling a meeting with you, Thien. Well, actually, it was just me and Gay asking to speak with you and Jen Carroll. And you said, you know what, just bring everybody. Let's talk openly. And it was that meeting, I believe, that we shared with you what we wanted to happen. We wanted all for one and one for all, and for the uncharged cases. And I won't explain all that. You can do that if you like, but to be treated the same as the charged cases. And that is indeed what happened. The plea for DeAngelo was he had to admit, what's the other word? He had to plea and to admit to all the crimes, all of them. Right.
Both the ones that were charged and uncharged.
Right. He had to say guilty, and yeah.
Yes, and I admit. And I wanted him to say the word "I admit," so that each of the victims, charged and uncharged, were able to obtain a measure of justice.
Yes. And that was such an emotional day. I would say the only disappointment, and I'm going to say, I understand why, but at that point, because along with the support that we got from Sacramento County and the respect that you gave each one of us as victims, we met each other. And we created an extremely strong support system. We met every single time there was a hearing, away from the media. We would meet at either Carol Daly's home or mine, so we could talk privately. We were there for each other. And so by the time that this plea hearing was happening, we were pretty strong. And we were crusaders. Like, this is not our fault. We did nothing wrong. This happened to us, not because of us. And we were ready to have our names out loud because we didn't want to be anonymous. We weren't ashamed. And we were told, yes, you can. And then we were told, no, you can't. And I understand why, because there were so many different people that said, no, I don't want mine. And so many people that said, yes, I do mine. And we needed to stay on the side of caution. But with that said, we were very disappointed. But with that said, we were able to find a workaround. And we went through our victim advocate, Maylin, and said, okay, can we stand up when they say our case? And by us, again, this is the respect that came back to us through Sac County. They said yes. And so maybe our names weren't said, but when they came to my case, when they came to Gay's case, when our families stood, so that people on TV, people in the room, anyone could see that we were real people. We were not a Jane Doe. We were not anonymous. We were real, live people. And that meant the world to me.
I remember when you're talking about standing up, and it's about Phyllis. And Phyllis, was on TV, and Phyllis identified herself, so I can say her name. I still get a little emotional when I think about it, but when, she was going through cancer and getting treatment, so she couldn't be there at the plea. And so when it was time for her case, all of the survivors and victims stood up to represent Phyllis. And I got to tell you, that was such a moving, powerful moment that will be one of the things that will stick with me for the rest of my life. Whenever I think about the case, I don't think about him anymore. I think about all the survivors, and I think about those days where we got justice. And that was such a beautiful, powerful moment. But Gay, let me ask you, when you look back at the case, what's the one thought that you think of?
Well, I first of all, I can't express how grateful I was to learn first in 2012, when Paul Holes called me to investigate my case further, that law enforcement had not given up on solving this crime. That was the first I knew, from 1978 until 2012. Then I I cooperated with Paul as best I could and gave him every shred of information I could dig back through that might help him. And that took its toll. And I understood when at the end of that time, which took a couple years, maybe 2014, the case was still not resolved. But that he was still working on it, and other law enforcement people were still working on it. But I understood that roller coaster that all law enforcement was continuing to go through the decades, thinking they had a suspect, they worked that suspect, and then found that it wasn't the East Area Rapist. And so it was disheartening to me when that happened to me after putting the whole thing away for like 35 years, and then having all that come back to the surface. And then a few years later, finding out on TV that he had been arrested. And one of the things Sacramento did that I know helped their victims a lot was that they notified them ahead of time. And I was not notified ahead of time. I learned when my daughters called me because they found out about it from the media. My adult daughters informed me of the arrest, and then I saw it on TV. And after that, I called my local district attorney. So I really appreciate, number one, that law enforcement never gave up. I appreciate how your county handled the notification of the victims. And I can tell you that that would have helped me a lot to be notified ahead of time, because I did find it shocking and I wasn't prepared at that time. And then finding my voice through the survivor group and being heard by the Sacramento advocates and by you. And I think we've talked before. I felt like Sacramento finally had no choice but to adopt me because I was constantly knocking at the door, asking for information, and my local jurisdiction just didn't participate. And the other thing when we talk about the interactions with police that I did want to say was that when something like this happens and the police give a statement, as Stockton Police Department did, is that they came to the media and they said, yes, we understand that there's been an arrest, but we don't have any, we just don't have any evidence to the effect that these two cases were in fact part of that spree. So the fact that they went on TV and said that, what I heard is that, you said it was the East Area Rapist, but we don't really have any evidence to that effect. What they really meant was that they didn't have any left. They did have physical evidence at the time, but it had been discarded over the decades. And so for me, hearing a message like that came right back to putting the burden on me that I felt like I have said and others have said that this happened to me, but the police department is saying, well, we can't really prove that. And so that was hard. And that caused me to use, to really go to the survivor group and to start trying to find my voice. And once I did pursue it farther, then I found you and the advocates there to help me. And that was a blessing.
I have to tell you, Gay and Kris, it was an honor of a lifetime for me to stand in the courtroom and to work outside of the courtroom to be your advocate, to make sure that you and all the other survivors got justice on the case. And I'll give you a little insight into, in terms of the efforts since the 70s and the 80s. I met detectives that after they retired, continued to work on the case in their private capacity. In fact, there was one detective that was even following people as a private investigator because he thought somebody was the East Area Rapist or the Golden State Killer. And what would happen is generations of officers, once they had the file, a new group would come in, whether it was to sexual assault or to homicides. We would have it. We had all the files in a room over at the sheriff's department and over at the police department. And a new group would come in, a new group of detectives. And when they come in, they would get assigned a cold case, whether it was this case or that case. But there would be one series of detectives, and they would open it up and they would look at it again and go over it again. And then the next generation of officers come in, would do the same thing. And so starting on the case, and you've heard about it now, the DAs didn't give up. I know that Anne-Marie Schubert and Greg Totten and the other DAs from Santa Barbara, they just kept working on the case. And we were fortunate enough and persistent enough to find him, to locate him and bring him to justice. But I can tell you that nobody in law enforcement, nobody in the DA's office ever gave up. But here's the thing. Neither did you guys. You never gave up. You never gave up, I think, hope. And at the end of the day, you were always there for us when we were in the courtroom, making sure that you had our back and that we had your back. And so I really appreciate both of you taking the time today to come speak on the podcast. And I really appreciate, I think we all can, the advocacy work that you're doing now. On behalf of the Sacramento DA's office and everybody here, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thien.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.